A tale of love and hope. Welcome, my friends. Allow me to share with you a story of love that blossomed unexpectedly, set against the backdrop of everyday struggles and moments of pure kindness. A tale of how love can change even the most ordinary of lives. I hope you enjoy it. Emily stepped off the creaky bus, her boots crunching on the frozen sidewalk as she made her way down the street. The wind was biting, a chill that seeped right through the thick woolen coat she had worn since high school. Her cheeks flushed from the cold, and her dark brown hair fluttered in disarray as she hurried toward her small house at the end of Maple Avenue. It wasn't much. A one-story home with faded blue siding, a sagging porch that creaked whenever you stepped on it, and a mailbox that had seen better days. But to Emily, it was home. It had always been home. It was the place where her mother had raised her, and where, just a year ago, she had said her final goodbye after a long battle with cancer. The memories of her mother, once vibrant and full of life, were like a bittersweet melody that played in Emily's mind, every note haunting yet comforting. The house, though modest, was filled with traces of her. The smell of lavender from the candles she used to light at night, the old armchair by the window where they had spent hours talking, the tiny kitchen where they shared countless meals. Emily paused at the front door, feeling the weight of her loss yet again. She had promised her mother that she would keep the house, keep the memory alive, but the loneliness was starting to feel unbearable. A year had passed, and with each day the ache in her chest seemed to deepen. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, the warmth of the house surrounding her like an old, familiar embrace. The floorboards creaked under her feet as she hung up her coat, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall filling the silence. After a long day of working at the diner, Emily was exhausted, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing from her life, an emptiness that she couldn't explain, even though everything around her seemed perfectly fine. With a sigh, Emily made her way to the kitchen to fix herself a cup of tea. She didn't have much for dinner, but she wasn't particularly hungry. The small comforts of a cup of chamomile tea and the quiet of her home were all she could offer herself at the end of another long day. Sitting at the kitchen table, the hot mug in her hands, Emily glanced at the photo of her mother that stood proudly on the windowsill. Her mother's smile in the photograph seemed to shine through the years, even though she was no longer there to share in her joys and sorrows. Emily reached out, running her fingers along the frame, feeling the familiar pang of grief. "I miss you, Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible as the tears threatened to fall. But she quickly wiped them away, not wanting to succumb to the sadness that often overtook her in the quiet moments of solitude. She stood up and, after finishing her tea, made her way to her bedroom. The bed was cold and empty, but she climbed in anyway, pulling the heavy blankets over her and trying to find sleep. As she closed her eyes, the overwhelming feeling of something missing still lingered. But no matter how hard she searched within herself, she couldn't name what that something was. The next evening, after another long day at the diner, Emily was preparing to close up when the bell above the door jingled, signaling the arrival of a customer. She glanced up, expecting to see one of the regulars, perhaps Mr. Thompson, the elderly man who came in every evening for a cup of coffee. But instead she found herself staring at a tall, disheveled young man, his unkempt hair falling into his stormy blue eyes. His clothes were worn and too big for him, the fabric threadbare from the wear of time. He shuffled over to the far corner booth, sitting down heavily as though the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. Emily took a moment to observe him, her curiosity piqued. He didn't seem like the typical diner patron. He wasn't ordering a big meal or chatting with friends. He was alone, as though lost in his own thoughts. With a sigh, Emily grabbed a menu and walked over to the booth. She smiled warmly, despite her tiredness, hoping to offer a friendly gesture. "Welcome to Rosie's Diner," she greeted him. "What can I get you tonight?" The man looked up at her, his gaze piercing and distant, as though he hadn't expected someone to speak to him. He blinked as though pulling himself out of a trance. "Just a cup of coffee, please," he murmured, his voice rough. Emily nodded and went to fill the coffee cup. As she poured the steaming liquid, her mind wandered to the man. He seemed like he was going through something, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what. He looked as if he had been worn down by life, perhaps even more so than she had been.